Hi guys, here's a mini tutorial on creating an apple in gouache. I chose this subject because it'll allow us to study several capabilities of gouache at the same time. So our ability to use it as a watercolor and our ability to layer it in a way more similar to oils or acrylics. We're going to be doing a dilute base painting in order to capture the reflected light on the lower portion of the apple and using opaque layers and brush strokes to capture the texture and upper highlights of the apple. Remember that even when layering, gouache will adopt elements of the color of the lower layers, so we do want to be careful to leave highlights relatively clear of base paint, even if we intend to paint with white over them later. In gouache paints, darker colors tend to dry lighter and lighter colors, including white, darker, so it's a balancing act. That being said, so long as it's only used in moderation, you can cheat the system by adding some acrylic white to your highlights if you find your gouache white highlights aren't bright enough at the end of the painting. So here is our reference. I recommend watching the tutorial, then returning to this image, pausing here, and working from the reference directly in your painting. Just a few notes on terminology. When I refer to reflected light, I'm referring to the areas that light is reflected in the shade on the lower half of the apple. The highlights are those whiter areas on the top of the apple. So to begin with, you may wish to do a sketch of the apple or just start painting directly. And what I'm doing here is I'm mixing together three colors that I'm going to dilute. A muddy blue, muddy red, and muddy yellow. I'm using the same mixing brush for each. And then diluting these colors with water, I'm creating a base painting for the apple that's following the reflected light on the lower half. So essentially I'm putting down layers that are going to be visible only later when I pick up the heavier, more saturated layers. Once I get this base layer down, I'm going to be mixing together a couple colors, showing the more opaque layers on the upper half of the apple, and coming down with a more saturated layer of paint. I'm moving my brush strokes to follow any patterns within the apple, so those little sort of stripy marks I'm getting by using a relatively dry brush. And I'm layering colors side by side so that they're easier to mix together. Gouache paints dry really quickly, so pre-mixing a couple of colors and placing them next to one another essentially when you're painting can be a useful way of ensuring that they blend smoothly. As I move along, I'm adjusting the colors, and it's important to note again that your colors are going to change based on what layers are underneath them, so you might need to adjust them. And another thing I'm doing is I'm coming in with a wet brush and I'm picking up paint that I've put down before. So in those reflected areas, that reflected light, I'm coming back in with a wet brush, picking up paint I've put down, and that's revealing that initial color that I've put in. You also need to sort of manage your time when painting in gouache, so I'm strategically moving on to the shadow when I know that there are layers that I need to dry. The problem with gouache is you can't quite dry it with a hairdryer like you might with watercolors, as that does tend to crack the upper layers of paint. So you do need to allow your wet paint to essentially cool dry. And one of the ways to do that is just delegate your time so that you're working across the apple. To get those little kind of stippling marks over the apple, those little like white specks, I'm coming in with a wet, narrow brush and picking up some of the paint I've already put down in spots. And then I'm just working across the apple, essentially, building in more color into those highlights and building in more saturated color in the areas that I can see it within the reference. So experimentation is key here. So I'd recommend doing a couple studies of apples or other fruit you have around the house where you have a mix of those reflective qualities and that local value, so that color that's really intrinsic to the subject that you're painting. So thank you for watching, happy painting, and I'm just going to put up at the very end the reference again so you can work from that directly. Okay, bye.